The theory of human rights is intertwined with personal identity, which can be studied in the enforcement of residential schools. The deprivation of human rights allows atrocities to be committed. Said atrocities during Indigenous children's learning years makes trauma a huge portion of their early life, and this trauma disconnects them from their Indigenous roots. The example chosen for the world issue was the enforcement of residential schools. From 1876 to 1997, large groups of Indigenous children were forced into these schools. This was to forcefully assimilate them into Euro-Canadian society. And John Locke's theory of human rights, which are life, liberty, and property, will be applied to this event. Firstly, when someone is deprived of human rights, they have vastly different experiences than those that do. In regular schools at the time, the harshest punishments were whacks with a stick. Within residential schools, there were cases of severe beating, starvation, being locked in a room, or other forms of abuse. The dichotomy of the treatment for Indigenous children and non-Indigenous children is evident. John Locke has this to say about unfair treatment. To love our neighbor as ourselves is such a truth for regulating human society that by that alone one might determine all the cases in social morality. This treatment for an Indigenous child's formative years traumatizes them, and this trauma becomes a part of their identity, as every point in their life afterwards is affected. So, a lack of protection of their human rights creates a basis for their identity. Secondly, the right to life, liberty, and property was violated by the enforcement of residential schools, and this violation creates the base of many Indigenous peoples' childhoods. Locke says, all mankind, being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. For an example of the rights violated, mass graves of Indigenous children show their right to life was violated, as they were abused and killed through neglect. Lack of freedom for Indigenous children was shown when children were snatched away or not allowed to see their families. These people were not given a say in the matter. Not being able to have any personal belongings shows the right to property being violated, which is notably seen with Phyllis Jack Webstad, who Orange Shirt Day is dedicated to, having her orange shirt taken away from her when she went into a residential school. The list can go on. Each time an Indigenous child was deprived of their rights, trauma was inflicted. This trauma, as stated previously, takes root in Indigenous people's lives, not just the children, but their families. Every right that the rest of Canada had was not seen within the schools. This deprivation of rights was intentional, as Indigenous people were not given the same respect as non-Indigenous people, and the intended effects of residential schools took place. Finally, the social stigma caused by the negative connotations due to a lack of human rights causes a disconnect between a person and their ethnic identities. These abuses that were inflicted on the basis of ethnicity, as previously stated, inflict trauma. Indigenous children were punished for doing anything that related to their culture, like having long hair, speaking their language, or practicing any traditions. So, they begin to associate abuse with their culture. They distance themselves for fear of being hurt, and thus a disconnect forms. This also forms a cycle as the disconnect from culture is passed on to their kids, an intergenerational trauma. This disconnect through trauma was intentional, as the children had to be cut off from their culture to fit into the Euro-Canadian standard, and said trauma is passed down, a basis for Indigenous peoples' identities for years to come. Through the intentional abuse, which was caused by depriving human rights, Indigenous people were stripped of their culture and identity. They were cut off from their roots, but still did not fit into Canadian standards, which caused a sense of being lost. Human rights and identity are intertwined because what is allowed to happen to you is determined by those rights. This trauma and abuse through residential schools was allowed because Indigenous people did not have their rights protected and will affect their community for years to come. Through studying this deprivation of human rights, the abuse that was allowed, and the effects said abuse caused on Indigenous people, you can see how closely human rights and personal identity are.